October 19th, 1942. Lieutenant Robert Lynch stood at the helm of PT-48, watching the dark water off Cape Esperance through his binoculars. The moon had set 2 hours ago, perfect conditions for what the Americans were calling the Tokyo Express, those high-speed Japanese destroyer runs that came screaming down the slot every few nights, delivering troops and supplies to Guadalcanal under cover of darkness. But tonight wasn't about destroyers. Lynch could see them out there, maybe 400 yards off the beach, Japanese barges. Daihatsu landing craft, the intelligence reports called them. Big steel things, 46 feet long, flat-bottomed, powered by diesel engines that made a distinctive, chuffing sound across the water. They were unloading supplies for the Japanese garrison, working methodically in the darkness. Lynch could count at least 6 of them, maybe more further down the coast. He ordered his crew to battle stations. PT-48 was an Elco 77-footer, one of the first motor torpedo boats to arrive at Tulagi back in October. She was 77 feet of mahogany planking over oak frames, powered by 3 Packard engines that could push her to 40 knots when everything was working right. She carried 4 Mark 8 torpedoes and 4 50-caliber machine guns in twin mounts. On paper, she was a ship killer, designed to dart in close to enemy warships, launch torpedoes, and race away into the night. But those torpedoes were useless against the barges Lynch was watching. The Mark 8 needed at least 10 feet of water to arm properly after launching. The Japanese barges drew maybe 5 feet, sometimes less when they were partially unloaded. The torpedoes would pass right underneath them, running harmlessly out to sea or burying themselves in the beach sand. Lynch had tried it before. Every PT boat commander in the Solomons had tried it. The torpedoes just didn't work against these shallow draft targets, so he'd have to rely on the 50-caliber guns. Lynch gave the order, and PT-48's engines rumbled to life, pushing her forward through the black water. At 300 yards, the gunners opened fire. The twin 50s hammered away, tracers arcing out across the water, sparking off the barge's hulls. Some rounds punched through, but most just ricocheted away into the night. The Japanese had been armoring these barges, welding extra steel plates to the sides and around the crew compartments. Intelligence said some of them could withstand 40-millimeter fire. The 50-caliber rounds, powerful as they were against aircraft and personnel, weren't doing much damage. The Japanese returned fire with their own machine guns and what looked like a 37-millimeter gun mounted on one of the larger barges. PT-48 twisted hard to port, laying down smoke, racing back out of range. Lynch cursed. Another failed attack. The barges would finish unloading and disappear up the coast before dawn. More supplies for the Japanese troops trying to retake Henderson Field. More ammunition for their artillery. More food to keep their garrison alive. 3 miles away, across the dark water and jungle, Henderson Field sat quiet under the stars. The Cactus Air Force pilots were asleep in their tents, exhausted from another day of combat missions. But scattered around the airfield's perimeter in various states of destruction sat the remains of at least a dozen P-39 Airacobra fighters. Some had been shot down by Zeros. Others had crash-landed with battle damage or engine failures. A few had simply worn out, their engines giving up after too many hours in the tropical heat and humidity. The P-39s weren't popular with American pilots. The aircraft had been designed around a single weapon, a 37mm automatic cannon that fired through the propeller hub. To make room for this unusual arrangement, Bell Aircraft had put the engine behind the pilot, driving the propeller through a 10-foot shaft that ran under the cockpit floor. The design gave the P-39 a unique silhouette and excellent low-altitude performance, but the single-stage supercharger meant it couldn't fight effectively above 15,000 feet. Against the nimble Japanese Zeros, which excelled at high altitude, the P-39 was outmatched. But sitting there in those wrecks, mounted in the nose of each aircraft, was a weapon that could solve Lynch's problem: the M4 37mm automatic cannon. Manufactured by Oldsmobile under license from Browning Arms Company, it was a recoil-operated autocannon with a distinctive curved magazine that held 30 rounds. The gun could fire 150 rounds per minute, sending 37mm high-explosive shells downrange at 2,000 feet per second. Against aircraft, it was devastating when it connected. Against thin-skinned barges, it would be absolute murder. Lynch knew the regulations. Modifying Navy equipment without authorization was forbidden. Installing weapon systems that hadn't been tested and approved by the Bureau of Ordnance was specifically prohibited. Taking parts from Army Air Force aircraft and mounting them on Navy vessels violated about 6 different protocols, but regulations didn't win battles. Results did. The next morning, Lynch and his crew went to Henderson Field with cutting torches, the plywood fleet. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what a PT boat actually was. Motor torpedo boats, the Navy called them officially, though everyone just said PT boat. They were the product of a late 1930s scramble to develop a fast attack craft that could challenge larger warships in restricted waters. The concept wasn't new. The British had been building motor torpedo boats since World War I, and by the late 1930s, most major navies had some version of the idea. The American development program began in earnest in 1938, when the Navy held a design competition that became known as the Plywood Derby. Multiple manufacturers submitted prototypes. Electric Boat Company's Elco division bought a British motor torpedo boat designed by Hubert Scott Payne and used it as the basis for their entry. Higgins Industries in New Orleans developed their own design based on their experience building landing craft and offshore racing boats. Huckins Yacht Corporation submitted a third design. By 1941, the Navy had settled on the Elco and Higgins designs as their standard PT boats. The Elco boats were 77 feet long initially, later stretched to 80 feet. They had a beam of 20 feet 8 inches and displaced about 56 tons fully loaded. Construction was entirely wood, mahogany planking over oak frames, built like fine furniture, but engineered to take punishment. The plywood construction made them light enough to achieve high speeds, but strong enough to handle combat damage that would sink a metal boat. 3 Packard 4M-2500 engines powered each boat, 12-cylinder supercharged monsters derived from the Liberty aircraft engine. Each engine produced 1,200 horsepower initially, later uprated to 1,500 horsepower as the war went on and more powerful armament was added. The 3 engines together gave the PT boat a top speed of around 41 knots in ideal conditions, though actual combat speeds were usually lower depending on sea state, fuel load, and armament configuration. The crew varied, but typically numbered between 12 and 17 men. 3 officers and 9 to 14 enlisted, crammed into a boat smaller than most people's houses. They lived, fought, and died in an environment that combined the claustrophobia of submarine warfare with the exposed vulnerability of surface combat. When a PT boat got hit, there was nowhere to hide. The thin wooden hull offered no protection against enemy fire. The gasoline engines were floating bombs, waiting for a spark. Standard armament in 1942 consisted of 4 Mark 8 torpedoes, each one 21 inches in diameter and weighing 2,600 pounds, with its 466-pound TNT warhead. The torpedoes were the PT boat's primary weapon, the reason they existed. 450 caliber machine guns in 2 twin mounts provided defensive armament, along with sometimes a single 20-millimeter cannon at the stern. Some boats carried depth charges, a few mounted rocket launchers. The armament was constantly evolving as crews discovered what worked and what didn't in actual combat. The Navy had envisioned PT boats operating against major warships, darting in close under cover of darkness to launch torpedo attacks against cruisers and battleships before racing away. It was a romantic notion, David versus Goliath on the water, and it made for good press coverage. But the reality of PT boat operations in the Pacific turned out quite different. By October 1942, 2 PT boat squadrons were operating out of Tulagi in the Solomon Islands. Squadron 2 and Squadron 3, about 14 boats total, though mechanical failures and combat damage meant only 8 or 10 were operational on any given night. They were hunting the Tokyo Express, those Japanese destroyer runs that came down from Rabaul to resupply the garrison on Guadalcanal. The destroyers were hard targets, fast, heavily armed, with professional crews who knew how to fight at night. The PT boats scored some successes, damaging a few destroyers, but the big ships could outrun them and outgun them when it came to a fight. The real problem, though, wasn't the destroyers, it was the barges. The Barge War. The Japanese had learned quickly that bringing major warships down the slot in daylight was suicide. American aircraft from Henderson Field would find them and tear them apart. So they shifted tactics. Destroyers would make high-speed runs at night, dropping supplies in sealed drums that floated ashore or were picked up by smaller craft. But the real workhorse of Japanese resupply became the humble landing barge. The Daihatsu-class landing craft was 46 feet long, powered by a diesel engine that could push it to maybe 8 or 9 knots on a good day. It had a bow ramp like the American LCVP, though the Daihatsu's hull design made it more seaworthy. Each barge could carry 70 troops or about 10 tons of cargo or a single light tank. Construction was welded steel, utilitarian, and tough. The genius of the Daihatsu was its shallow draft, usually around 5 feet or less. This meant it could operate in coastal waters too shallow for destroyers, could navigate through reefs and around obstacles that would ground larger vessels, and most importantly, from the Japanese perspective, could deliver its cargo right onto the beach without needing dock facilities. For the Americans trying to stop them, that shallow draft was a nightmare. PT boat torpedoes ran too deep. Destroyer 5-inch guns could hit them, but you needed a destroyer in the right place at the right time. And the Japanese were getting very good at timing their barge runs to avoid American surface patrols. Aircraft could attack them during daylight, but the barges ran at night, hugging the coastline where they were almost impossible to spot from the air. The Japanese had also started armoring them. Field modifications mostly, welding extra steel plates to the hull and around the engine compartment and crew spaces. Intelligence reports indicated some barges could withstand 40-millimeter cannon fire, though this seemed optimistic to American crews who'd seen what 40-millimeter rounds could do. Still, the armor was thick enough that 50-caliber machine gun fire mostly bounced off. You could suppress the crews, keep their heads down, but you weren't sinking many barges with 50 cal alone. By mid-October 1942, the Japanese were moving significant supplies and reinforcements by barge. Estimates varied, but intelligence suggested as many as 40 or 50 barges operating on any given night along the Guadalcanal coast and between the various islands. Each successful barge run meant more Japanese soldiers, more ammunition, more food keeping the enemy garrison alive and fighting. The situation was getting critical. American forces had captured Henderson Field in August, but the Japanese weren't giving up. They'd launched 2 major ground offensives trying to retake the airfield, and while both had failed with heavy Japanese casualties, the enemy kept reinforcing. As long as the barges could keep running, the Japanese could sustain their forces. And as long as they could sustain their forces, the battle for Guadalcanal would continue grinding on, costing American lives. The PT boats needed a weapon that could kill barges, something with enough punch to penetrate the armor and hull, something accurate enough to hit a small, maneuverable target at night, something that could fire fast enough to put multiple rounds into a barge before it could escape or return fire. The 50-caliber guns weren't cutting it. The 20-millimeter cannons were better, but still not quite enough. What they needed was something like a 37 mm cannon, the Airacobra's gift. The Bell P-39 Airacobra was one of the most unusual fighter aircraft of World War II. Most fighters were designed around their engine, but the P-39 was designed around its gun. The 37 mm automatic cannon, officially designated the M4 but often called the Oldsmobile gun after one of its manufacturers, was mounted in the nose with its barrel firing through the hollow propeller shaft. To make this arrangement work, Bell's engineers had to put the Allison Fire 1710 engine behind the pilot, driving the propeller through a 10-foot extension shaft. The result was an aircraft that looked different from anything else in the sky. The tricycle landing gear was another innovation, the first American fighter to use it. The mid-engine placement meant the pilot sat higher and further forward than in conventional fighters, giving excellent visibility. The design also protected the engine from frontal attacks, though it made the aircraft vulnerable to attacks from behind. Performance-wise, the P-39 was a mixed bag. At low altitude, below 12,000 feet, it was fast and maneuverable. The mid-engine placement gave it excellent roll rate, and the handling was generally praised. But the single-stage, single-speed supercharger meant performance fell off dramatically above 15,000 feet. In European combat, where most engagements happened at 20,000 feet or higher, the P-39 was outclassed. The British tried it briefly in 1941 and quickly relegated it to training duties. In the Pacific, things were somewhat better. Combat often happened at lower altitudes, where the P-39 could compete. The big 37 mm cannon was devastating against Japanese aircraft when it connected. And the additional armament of 2 nose-mounted 50 caliber guns and sometimes 4 wing-mounted guns gave good firepower. But the Zero was still more maneuverable, especially at higher altitudes, and Japanese pilots quickly learned to force combat upward where the P-39 struggled. By October 1942, Henderson Field had received several squadrons of P-39s as part of the Cactus Air Force. They flew ground attack missions, strafing Japanese positions, attacking barges and small craft during daylight hours, and occasionally tangling with Zeros when they couldn't avoid it. The aircraft took losses, some to combat, some to accidents, some to simple mechanical failure in the harsh tropical environment. The wrecks piled up around Henderson Field. The mechanics salvaged what they could, parts to keep other aircraft flying, but much of the material was just written off. Damaged fuselages were pushed aside to clear the runway. Torn-off wings became improvised shelters or were cannibalized for sheet metal. And in each wrecked nose section, mounted on its special bracket with its curved magazine and recoil mechanism, sat an M4 37mm automatic cannon. The M4 was a sophisticated piece of engineering. Designed by John Browning's company and manufactured primarily by Colt and Oldsmobile, it used a long recoil action with a vertically sliding breech block. The curved magazine held 30 rounds in a distinctive horseshoe shape, designed to fit the tight confines of the P-39's nose. Rate of fire was around 150 rounds per minute, limited by the recoil mechanism and the magazine capacity. Muzzle velocity was 2,000 feet per second for the high explosive rounds. The ammunition was the key. The standard M54 high explosive round weighed about 2 pounds and carried enough explosive to do serious damage to aircraft. Against a thin-skinned barge, it would be devastating. The round could also penetrate light armor. There was an armor-piercing version, the M80, that could punch through an inch of steel plate at 500 yards, though these weren't commonly available in the Pacific theater. The gun weighed 213 pounds without ammunition, compact enough to be manageable, but heavy enough that it would need a solid mount. The curved magazine was the tricky part. It worked fine when the gun was mounted horizontally in an aircraft nose, but on a boat deck that could be pitching and rolling, feeding might become an issue. The electrical firing system used in aircraft wouldn't work on a boat without significant modification. But these were solvable problems. Lieutenant Lynch looked at the wrecked P-39s scattered around Henderson Field and saw a solution to his barge problem. Getting the guns wouldn't be difficult. Technically, the Army Air Force owned them, but the Air Force liaison officers at Henderson were practical men who understood the realities of combat. If the Navy could use these guns to kill Japanese barges, the Air Force wasn't going to object. The real challenge was mounting them on a PT boat in a way that would actually work. Improvisation at Henderson Field. The machine shops at Henderson Field were primitive by mainland standards. Canvas, tents with dirt floors, powered by portable generators that ran on gasoline, scrounged from crashed aircraft and damaged fuel dumps. The machinists were a mix of Navy and Marine Corps personnel, mostly petty officers who'd worked in civilian machine shops or automotive garages before the war. They had basic tools, some welding equipment, and the kind of practical engineering knowledge that comes from years of fixing things with whatever materials are available. Lynch brought his problem to them in late October. He needed a mount for the 37mm cannon that would be stable enough to aim accurately, strong enough to handle the recoil, and simple enough to build with available materials. The mount also needed to allow traverse and elevation so the gunner could track moving targets. And it needed to be removable in case this whole experiment turned out to be a disaster, and the Bureau of Ordnance demanded they put everything back the way it was. The machinists studied the M4 cannon, measured its recoil characteristics, calculated the forces involved. One of them had worked at a gun factory in Pennsylvania before the war and understood the principles. Another had been a welder on construction projects in Chicago and knew how to build frames that wouldn't shake themselves apart. Together they came up with a design. The mount was basically a pedestal, welded steel plate forming a base that could be bolted to the PT boat's deck. A vertical post rose from the base with a bearing assembly that allowed rotation for traverse. The gun was mounted on a yoke that allowed elevation and depression through an arc of maybe 60 degrees. The whole assembly was crude, agricultural even, but it was solid. The welds were done carefully, multiple passes to ensure strength. The bearing surfaces were machined as smooth as the available tools allowed. The electrical firing system from the aircraft couldn't be used, so they rigged a manual trigger mechanism, a simple lever that the gunner could pull to fire. The curved magazine would be mounted in its standard position on the gun. Reloading would be slow, about 15 or 20 seconds to swap magazines, but with 30 rounds available before needing to reload, that seemed acceptable. The question of where to mount the gun took some discussion. The bow seemed like the obvious choice, giving the best field of fire forward where most targets would appear. But the PT boat's bow rose and fell significantly in even moderate seas, which would make aiming difficult. The stern was more stable, but had limited fields of fire. They eventually settled on mounting it on the foredeck, just forward of the chart house. This gave reasonable stability, good fields of fire to both sides and forward, and didn't interfere too much with the boat's existing armament and torpedo tubes. PT-48 was hauled up onto the beach for the installation. The machinists worked for 2 days, carefully positioning the mount, drilling holes through the mahogany deck for the mounting bolts, adding reinforcing plates underneath to distribute the stress. The recoil of a 37mm cannon was significant, and they didn't want the mount tearing loose in combat. When the gun was finally installed, they test-fired it with a few rounds aimed out to sea. The boat shuddered with each shot, but the mount held solid. The curved magazine fed properly. The manual trigger worked smoothly. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. Lynch took PT-48 out the next night, November 2nd, looking for barges. He found 3 of them off Camimbo Bay, unloading supplies onto the beach. The normal approach would have been to race in with the .50 calibers blazing, hoping to suppress the barge crews and maybe set something on fire. Instead, Lynch brought his boat in slowly, cutting speed at 800 yards to reduce wake and noise. At 400 yards, he ordered the 37mm gunner to open fire. The first few rounds were ranging shots, geysers of water erupting near the lead barge as the gunner found the target. Then the shells started hitting. The high explosive rounds punched through the barge's armor like it wasn't there, detonating inside with bright flashes that lit up the night. The barge began taking on water immediately. Its crew abandoned it, swimming for shore or jumping into the other barges. Lynch's gunner shifted fire to the second barge. 6 rounds, maybe 8, each one hitting. The barge exploded, fuel or ammunition cooking off, sending debris high into the air. The third barge was already running, its diesel engine straining to push it away from the kill zone. Lynch's helmsman twisted PT-48 to bring the gun to bear. The gunner fired again. The range was opening, maybe 600 yards now, but the 37mm rounds were still accurate. The barge took hits along its stern, the engine compartment area. It slowed, then stopped, listing to one side as water poured in through the holes. 3 barges destroyed in less than 5 minutes of firing. PT-48 had expended about 80 rounds of 37mm ammunition. The 50 caliber guns hadn't fired a shot. Lynch radioed the kill report back to Tulagi, where the squadron commander was monitoring the night's patrols. The response came back within minutes. Repeat previous message. Confirm 3 barges destroyed. Lynch confirmed 3 barges destroyed. With a cannon stripped from a crashed P-39 and mounted on his boat with a welded steel pedestal and some reinforcing plates. The word spreads. News of Lynch's success spread through the PT boat squadrons like wildfire. By dawn on November 3rd, every boat commander at Tulagi was asking about the 37mm installation. Could they get one? How long would it take? Was there enough ammunition available? The practical realities of combat had just demonstrated what Navy bureaucracy would take months to acknowledge. The M4 cannon was the perfect weapon for killing barges. The machine shops at Henderson Field went into high gear. More P-39 wrecks were scavenged for their nose guns. More welded pedestals were fabricated. The design was refined slightly with each installation, little improvements in the traverse mechanism, better reinforcing under the deck, easier magazine access. By mid-November, 6 more PT boats had received 37mm installations. By December, it was 10 boats. The modification was spreading squadron to squadron, boat to boat, passed along through informal channels without waiting for official approval. The crews loved it. For the first time, they had a weapon that could reliably kill barges at combat ranges. The psychological effect was significant. PT boat crews had been feeling frustrated, launching attacks night after night with minimal results. Now, they were coming back with confirmed kills, sometimes multiple barges in a single patrol. Morale soared. The Japanese were starting to avoid areas where PT boats were known to operate, which meant the barges were being forced to take longer, more dangerous routes, or reduce their resupply runs altogether. Some boats experimented with multiple gun installations. PT-59, which had been badly damaged by a Japanese destroyer and subsequently converted to a gunboat configuration, ended up with 2 37mm cannons, one forward and one aft. Other boats tried mounting the cannon on different positions, testing what worked best for their particular operating patterns. A few boats kept the single-shot Army M337mm anti-tank gun they'd already scrounged and added the automatic M4 as well, though this proved to be too much weight for the bow and was eventually abandoned. The ammunition supply became the limiting factor. Each magazine held 30 rounds, and a typical night patrol might involve multiple barge contacts. Boats were returning to base with their magazines empty, having fired 90 or 120 rounds in a few hours of combat. Henderson Field's Ordnance Depot had M4 ammunition stocks, since the P-39 squadrons needed it, but sharing with the Navy meant less for the Air Force. The logistics officers worked it out, establishing a priority system that ensured critical aircraft got their ammunition first, while still supporting the PT boat's needs. The Bureau of Ordnance in Washington began receiving reports about the field modifications in late November. The official response was, predictably, concerned. Installing unauthorized weapon systems on Navy vessels was against regulations. Using Army equipment on Navy boats created supply chain complications. The lack of proper testing meant potential safety issues. There were questions about liability if something went wrong. But the combat results were undeniable. Squadron commanders were reporting significantly increased success rates against Japanese barge traffic. The toll of destroyed and damaged barges was climbing steadily. Intelligence analysts noted that Japanese resupply operations seemed to be disrupting, with fewer successful barge runs getting through to Guadalcanal. The field modification was working. A team of ordnance specialists was dispatched from Pearl Harbor to Tulagi in December to assess the situation. They examined the installations, interviewed the crews, reviewed the combat reports. Their conclusion was cautious but positive. The M4 installation appeared to be effective and reasonably safe, though a properly engineered mount designed specifically for naval use would be preferable to the improvised pedestals being used in the field. The recommendation went up through channels. Approve the 37mm installation as an interim measure while developing a proper production mount. In the meantime, continue allowing the field modifications, but with some standardization to ensure quality control. By January 1943, the Bureau of Ordnance had officially blessed what the PT boat crews had been doing for 2 months, from improvisation to standard equipment. The official approval of the 37mm installation in early 1943 changed everything. What had been a field modification, accomplished with scrounged parts and improvised mounts, became a factory standard installation on new PT boats coming off the production lines. Both Elco and Higgins, the two primary PT boat manufacturers, began incorporating 37mm cannon mounts into their designs. The production mounts were significantly more refined than the welded pedestals built at Henderson Field. Engineers at both companies designed proper naval gun mounts with smooth traverse mechanisms, precise elevation controls, and robust construction that could handle sustained use in the harsh marine environment. The mounts were typically installed on the foredeck, though some boats had them mounted amidships or even aft, depending on the boat's overall armament configuration. The Bureau of Ordnance also began looking at improved versions of the M4 cannon specifically for naval use. This led to the development of the M9 37mm cannon, which used a more powerful cartridge and achieved 50% higher muzzle velocity than the M4. The M9 was heavier and longer, but it hit harder and had better range. Beginning in 1944, the M9 began replacing the M4 on factory-fresh PT boats, while boats already in service continued using their M4s. The disintegrating link belt system developed for the M10 variant, which was used on later P-63 King Cobra aircraft, was also adapted for some naval installations. This allowed for larger ammunition capacity and easier reloading compared to the curved 30-round magazines. Some PT boats in 1944 and 1945 were equipped with belt-fed 37mm systems that could carry 58 rounds ready to fire. By mid-1943, the 37mm cannon had become standard equipment on most PT boats operating in the Pacific. It was joined by other weapons in what became an increasingly heavy armament suite. The 40mm Bofors cannon, which had been adapted from anti-aircraft use to surface combat, became another standard installation on many boats. Some carried 20mm Oerlikon cannons, multiple 50-caliber machine gun mounts, rocket launchers, and even mortars. The PT boats were transforming from torpedo boats that happened to carry guns into heavily armed gunboats that could still launch torpedoes if needed. By war's end, some PT boats had more firepower per ton than any other vessel in the U.S. Navy. The original concept of darting in to attack major warships with torpedoes had given way to a new role: hunter-killer of small craft, coastal patrol vessel, and mobile artillery platform. The 37mm cannon was central to this transformation. It gave PT boats the ability to engage and destroy the Japanese barges, coastal cargo vessels, and small warships that made up the bulk of enemy logistics in the island-hopping campaigns. As the war moved westward across the Pacific, from Guadalcanal to the Solomons to New Guinea to the Philippines, the PT boats and their 37mm cannons went along, hunting at night in the narrow waters between islands. Combat record and Japanese response. The combat effectiveness of the 37mm armed PT boats exceeded even the optimistic projections of the crews who'd first installed them. Squadron after squadron reported increasing success rates against Japanese barge traffic through 1943 and 1944. The barges, which had been almost immune to PT boat attack in early 1942, became vulnerable targets once the 37mm cannon came into play. A typical engagement would see a PT boat detecting barges on radar or visually spotting them silhouetted against the shore. The boat would close to effective range, usually 400 to 600 yards, and the 37mm gunner would open fire. The high explosive rounds would tear into the barge's hull and superstructure, often starting fires or detonating fuel and ammunition. Barges that weren't destroyed outright would be disabled, taking on water or losing propulsion, making them easy targets for follow-up attacks or leaving them stranded for American aircraft to finish off at dawn. The Japanese tried various countermeasures. They increased the armor on their barges, but this made them slower and reduced cargo capacity. They armed the barges more heavily with machine guns and light cannons, which made them more dangerous targets but didn't prevent the 37mm rounds from penetrating. They tried running barges in larger convoys with destroyer escorts, but this concentrated targets and made the convoys more vulnerable to American surface ships and submarines. Some Japanese commanders tried scheduling barge runs for periods when weather or moon conditions made PT boat operations more difficult. Others attempted to suppress PT boat bases with air attacks, though this rarely achieved significant results. The fundamental problem was that the PT boats with 37-millimeter cannons had found a tactical niche where they were extremely effective, and there was no easy counter. The Japanese began calling PT boats devil boats, or sometimes green dragons, terms that reflected both fear and respect. The night attacks, seemingly coming from nowhere, tearing apart supply barges that Japanese commanders desperately needed to sustain their garrisons, had a psychological impact beyond the simple tonnage destroyed. The knowledge that American PT boats were hunting in the coastal waters forced changes in Japanese logistics planning, routing, and operations. By late 1943, Japanese barge traffic in the Solomons had been significantly disrupted. Intelligence estimates suggested that PT boats were intercepting and destroying roughly 1 in 3 barge runs, a devastating loss rate that the Japanese couldn't sustain. The campaign for Guadalcanal had already been decided by this point, with the Japanese evacuating in February 1943, but the PT boat operations continued up the Solomons chain and into New Guinea waters. The total score of Japanese vessels destroyed by PT boats armed with 37-millimeter cannons is difficult to calculate precisely. Different sources give different numbers, and there's the usual fog of war confusion about what constitutes a confirmed kill versus a probable or damaged. But conservative estimates suggest that PT boats destroyed more than 800 Japanese barges and small cargo vessels during the war, with the 37-millimeter cannon being the primary weapon responsible for the majority of these kills. This doesn't include the secondary effects: damaged barges that sank later, supplies destroyed even when the barge itself survived, Japanese troops killed or wounded during attacks, the disruption to Japanese logistics caused by having to reroute or delay barge runs, the psychological impact on Japanese commanders trying to sustain isolated garrisons with unreliable supply lines. The 37-millimeter cannon also proved effective against other targets. PT boats used them against Japanese coastal defenses, small warships, seaplanes caught on the water, and even submarines. There are recorded instances of PT boats using their 37-millimeter cannons in surface engagements against Japanese destroyers and destroyer escorts. Though these encounters were risky and the PT boats were usually outmatched by the larger ships' heavier armament. The broader impact. The story of the 37-millimeter cannon on PT boats is more than just a tale of battlefield improvisation. It's a case study in how warfare evolves, how doctrine adapts to reality, and how the best military innovations often come from the people actually doing the fighting, rather than from planners sitting in offices thousands of miles from combat. The PT boat cruise at Guadalcanal in October 1942 had a problem. They couldn't effectively attack the Japanese barges that were sustaining the enemy garrison. The weapons they had been issued weren't working, so they looked around at what was available, found a solution in the form of crashed aircraft cannons, and implemented that solution without waiting for permission from higher authority. It was practical, it was ingenious, and it violated regulations. The remarkable thing is that the Navy, once presented with evidence that the field modification actually worked, chose to approve it and incorporate it into standard practice, rather than shut it down for being unauthorized. This kind of institutional flexibility isn't universal in military organizations. Many armed forces would have insisted on following proper procedures, conducting extensive testing, waiting for official approval before allowing widespread adoption. The American military culture in World War II, particularly in the Pacific theater, where distances and communication challenges created more autonomy for local commanders, tended to favor results over procedure. If something worked, if it helped win battles and save American lives, it was likely to be approved even if it bent or broke the rules. This pragmatic approach to military innovation was one of America's advantages in the war. The 37mm cannon installation also demonstrated the value of inter-service cooperation. The guns came from Army Air Force aircraft. The installations were done by Navy and Marine Corps machinists. The ammunition came from Army ordnance stocks. In a military culture that often struggles with inter-service rivalry, this kind of practical cooperation at the operational level was notable. The modification also highlighted the importance of adaptability in weapon systems. The M4 cannon had been designed as an anti-aircraft weapon for fighters. Its designers at Browning Arms Company and its manufacturers at Colt and Oldsmobile had never envisioned it being mounted on wooden boats to attack steel barges. Yet, the gun's characteristics, its rate of fire and hitting power, made it ideal for exactly that role. Good weapons often find uses beyond their original design parameters. Looking at the broader sweep of naval warfare, the PT boat with its 37mm cannon represented a particular moment in military technology. These were relatively small, relatively cheap vessels that could achieve tactical effects disproportionate to their size through speed, firepower, and the advantage of darkness. They filled a niche that larger warships couldn't occupy, hunting in shallow coastal waters where destroyers and cruisers couldn't operate effectively. This niche didn't last. By the 1950s and 1960s, guided missiles and improved radar systems were changing the nature of small boat warfare. The wooden-hulled, gasoline-powered PT boat gave way to aluminum-hulled, diesel-powered patrol boats and, eventually, to fast attack craft with anti-ship missiles. But during World War II, particularly in the island campaigns of the Pacific, The PT boat, with its scavenged aircraft cannon, was exactly the right tool for the job. Legacy. Of the hundreds of PT boats built during World War II, only a handful survive today. Most were destroyed at war's end, either burned for their metal fittings or simply abandoned in remote locations where recovery wasn't economical. The wooden hulls that had been so advantageous in combat, light enough for speed and able to absorb damage that would sink steel boats, couldn't be preserved easily for post-war service. They rotted in the tropical heat or dried out and cracked in storage. PT-617, one of the few surviving Elco boats, is preserved at Battleship Cove in Fall River, Massachusetts. PT-796, a Higgins boat, sits beside her. PT-658, another Higgins boat, has been restored in Portland, Oregon. These survivors give modern visitors a sense of what the boats were like, how small they were compared to other warships, how cramped the crew spaces were, how exposed the gun positions were to enemy fire. None of the surviving boats have their original 37mm cannon installations. The guns were removed at war's end, along with the torpedoes and most other armament. But photographs from the war years show the distinctive curved magazine of the M4 cannon, the improvised mounts that gave way to factory installations, the gunners standing exposed on deck as they engaged enemy targets at night. The veterans who served on PT boats have mostly passed now. The youngest of them would be in their late 90s, and each year sees fewer survivors. They left behind memoirs and oral histories, accounts of night actions in the Solomons, harrowing destroyer attacks, successful barge hunts, the constant mechanical problems with the temperamental Packard engines, the fear and boredom and occasional terror of small boat warfare. Many of them remember the 37mm cannon fondly. It was the weapon that finally gave them a way to hurt the enemy effectively. It turned them from frustrated torpedo boat crews, watching barges escape night after night, into effective hunters who could claim confirmed kills and know they were making a difference in the campaign. The improvised solution, dreamed up at Henderson Field in October 1942, became standard equipment on hundreds of boats, destroyed hundreds of enemy vessels, and helped choke off Japanese logistics in the island campaigns. It's a reminder that sometimes the best military innovations come not from laboratories or design bureaus, but from sailors and soldiers who see a problem, recognize a solution, and have the initiative to implement it even when regulations say they shouldn't. That stripped-down P-39 nose, converted into a naval gun mount, helped win a war. Not through any single dramatic action, but through hundreds of small victories, night after night, barge after barge, slowly strangling the Japanese ability to sustain their forces across thousands of miles of ocean and jungle. The Japanese called them devil boats. They earned the name. If this story moved you, if learning about the PT boat crews who looked at crashed aircraft and saw a weapon they needed, If understanding how a field modification became a war-winning innovation resonates with you, then hit that like button. Every like tells the algorithm that these stories matter, that the history of how people actually fought and improvised and adapted deserves to be told. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. We're bringing you stories from World War II that don't make it into the textbooks. The kind of practical battlefield innovation and quiet heroism that changed the course of history. These men who welded aircraft cannons onto wooden boats and went hunting in the night, they deserve to be remembered. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Are you in the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, somewhere else entirely? Do you have family who served on PT boats or in the Pacific Theater? Share your connection to this history. We're building a community of people who believe these stories need to be preserved, and your participation keeps that mission alive. Thank you for watching. Thank you for helping make sure that the sailors who turned P-39 noses into devil boat weapons don't disappear into the forgotten corners of history.